Hi, my name is Mark Erikson, and today I'm very excited to talk to you about the state of Redux in 2021. A few things about myself. I am an answerer of questions. I will happily answer questions about React and Redux basically anywhere there's a text box on the internet. I am a collector of interesting links. I have a couple of very large repositories full of links to various React and Redux related articles and Redux related add-ons. I am a writer of very long blog posts. Among other things that I've written, my Idiomatic Redux series has posts on what I think are good Redux usage patterns and information on how Redux itself works. Last year I wrote a very long post that covers how React rendering behavior actually works. Gotten a lot of very positive feedback on that one. And I am a Redux maintainer. I've written several very large sections of the Redux documentation, including rewriting our tutorials last year. And I've done a lot of work on React-Redux, especially version 7, and I created Redux Toolkit. But if you're not familiar with me for any of those things, then you might know me as that guy with the Simpsons avatar, which has sort of become my calling card everywhere on the internet. So let's start with the question that usually comes up in any of these discussions. Is Redux dead? And the answer, of course, is no. It is very much alive and well. I did some estimates earlier this year as to the React State Management Library market share. And my rough estimates are that Redux is used by around 45 to 50% of all React apps. You have Apollo and XState and MobX, which all have some good amounts of usage. It looks like Redux Toolkit is up to about 10% of the overall Redux usage. And then you have libraries like React Query and SWR around 2.5% of the ecosystem as well. Redux is used in a number of very large applications that you're probably very familiar with and probably have open right now. And it's also important to note that Redux is primarily maintained by myself and Tim Dorr, along with some other folks like Lenz Weber and Matt Sikowski. It has never been a Facebook project. It has always been an independent package. And so based on all these factors, it's clear that Redux will be around for a very long time. If you look at some of the details from NPM stats over time, you can see that Redux is used considerably more than any of the other state management libraries. In fact, the absolute numbers have been going up over time. Now, NPM stats are not perfect. From what I've been told, they mostly represent CI and jobs being run. So it doesn't completely capture the actual usage details, but it is an objective metric that we can look at to get a sense of how much a package may be getting used. And frankly, it's about the only objective metric that we actually have. So just based on this one set of stats, we can see that Redux usage is increasing over time, not decreasing. I would like to address some of the common questions that typically come up about Redux and other tools in the ecosystem. A lot of people will say that Redux is overused, and I would actually very much agree with this, especially in 2016, 2017. We saw a lot of people using Redux in situations where it didn't necessarily even make sense, or people being told to use Redux even if it didn't necessarily solve any of the problems they were dealing with. And so really the important thing is that for any tool, you ought to try to take the time to consider why you're using that tool and what the trade-offs are in using it. So I've written a number of posts talking about this, like when does it make sense to use Redux? What problems does it actually solve? What are the trade-offs involved in using it? And I've got some links to those here. I think it's also worth noting that just because some people on Twitter are saying that a certain tool is dead or a new tool has come out which completely replaces another tool, that does not necessarily reflect in the actual usage and the behavior that's going on out in the ecosystem. A number of people have asked about whether GraphQL can replace Redux. And I think the important thing to understand here is that GraphQL itself is just a protocol for describing requests and responses. Now, when people say they're using GraphQL, typically that really implies that they're using a client like Apollo or Urkel, which has a lot of abstraction around fetching the data, caching it, and providing some kind of normalization to deduplicate the responses. And it's if you are doing something like that, and you were primarily using Redux for data fetching previously, then by choosing to use a tool that is specifically purpose-built for the process of handling data fetching and caching, then yeah, you probably have just replaced Redux at that point. And the same goes if you're looking at a library like React Query or SWR, which solve that same kind of data fetching use case, but in a more generic way and can work well with like a REST API or something. Again, like if the only thing you're using Redux for is caching server-side state, and you use a tool that is purpose-built for that problem, then you probably don't need Redux anymore at that point, unless you still have a significant amount of client-side state left over. Now, it is possible to use GraphQL and Redux together. The GraphQL request is just a plain, HTTP post that is formatted certain ways. So you can certainly make a request over with GraphQL and cache the data in Redux. It just doesn't come with anything out of the box for that. Now, the one that comes up all the time is people saying that React context replaces Redux, or that React hooks replace Redux. And I think this one is really a misunderstanding of what React context and what Redux actually do and what problems they solve. And the important thing here is that context is just a dependency injection system. It is not a state management tool. The only purpose for context is to take a single value and to pass it down to deeply nested components without having to pass it through as props the rest of the way. Now, React's legacy context API was broken in a lot of ways. And so there were many people who chose to use Redux just to avoid prop drilling and passing data down through multiple levels. Well, context is purpose-built for that use case. And if avoiding prop drilling was the only reason you chose to use Redux, well, context solved that. And it's also true that React's useReducer hook happens to look a lot like Redux, and it goes well with useContext. And if you put them together, you have something that starts to kind of resemble Redux and React-Redux. But both context and useReducer have some limitations. You can look at the current values using the React dev tools, but there's no way to see the historical values. There's no way to add middleware that can modify the behavior. And there are limits with with how context actually updates, which make it unsuitable for high performance updates in larger applications. Now, the React team is working on an experimental API called context selectors, but there's no indication at this point of when that will actually come out. It's very possible that when it's released, it will change some of this performance behavior situation. But until then, context is very limited in how it updates. It's also worth noting that context and hooks in Redux are not mutually exclusive topics. You can use hooks for local state, you can use context for passing down values in an application that is already using Redux and React-Redux. And in fact, React-Redux itself even has its own hooks API. So I put together an extensive post called Why React Context is Not a State Management Tool and Why It Doesn't Replace Redux. And I've tried to answer all the common questions and clearly explain what these tools are used for and what problems they solve and when it actually makes sense to use one or the other. Another thing I've noticed is that there really has been an evolution of the kinds of problems that developers are trying to solve over the last 5 or 6 years. In 2015, it was about predictable state updates. Facebook invented the Flux architecture to try to solve inconsistent values throughout their application, or to better understand what state is going to change when you make an update. And in 2021, what we see is that people are really focused on data fetching and caching. Developers don't want to spend a lot of time having to write code to track loading state and manage request lifecycles. They want to just call a single function that does all the data fetching process for them and gives them back some combination of an isLoading flag and the data value and an error without worrying about the details. And so you see libraries like Apollo and React Query and SWR and Urkel all solving very similar problems and with very similar API designs. So in some ways, the ecosystem has moved away from state management, and now we're focusing on data fetching. And we're going to come back to this topic in a minute. So overall, I would say that Redux is very alive and well. And I would also say that there are many, many great tools in today's ecosystem which solve problems that do overlap with a lot of the ways that Redux has been used over time. And so certainly there is less need to use Redux today than there was in 2016 and 2017. And it's certainly true that Redux has been overused in a lot of cases. But at the same time, there's still a lot of very good reasons to choose and use Redux, especially in conjunction with React. The idea of trying to write as much of your logic as pure functions, being able to trace when, where, why, and how your state has updated, being able to move logic outside the component tree, and then all the middleware and the ecosystem and the customizability that Redux gives you. So I've written a number of posts on this topic. This is probably the number one thing I spend my time talking about because this is the number one thing that people ask about. So I'd really recommend going through some of these posts. So summarizing, I would say that Redux is kind of a jack of all trades. It can do just about anything related to state management. It's just that it doesn't necessarily come out of the box with tools that solve all these use cases. And so it's maybe not going to be the best tool in a lot of situations compared to tools that have been purpose-built to solve those use cases. Now, I will also say that, or as I mentioned earlier, that trying to identify what your problems are and what tools can solve those problems, I think, is where a lot of people run into problems. And so earlier this year, I came up with this idea for a site that I've dubbed the React Community Tools and Practices site. And the idea is that we could have experts in the community try to provide guidance on what common tools are for different problems like state management and styling and data fetching, and focus on trying to provide information on when it makes sense to use a different tool. For example, when should you use inline styles versus CSS modules versus CSS and JS? When does it make sense to use something like a Redux versus a MobX versus an XState for state management? So I created a discussion. I got some feedback. I tried putting up a prototype that has a couple pages in it. I haven't had time to go back and add more details to this because I've been very, very focused on a lot of Redux development. But I would love to have this become an actual resource that the community contributes to and that can help provide guidance to developers on what tools are actually out there and what they could be using in different cases. So where this kind of leads up to, though, is Redux today is very, very different from the Redux you would have seen just a couple years ago. And there's multiple factors that contribute to this. First, we now have a package called Redux Toolkit that we recommend as the standard approach for writing Redux logic, and it drastically simplifies the amount of code you write in a Redux application. Redux Toolkit itself relies on a package called Immer, which lets you write mutating immutable updates in reducers. React-Redux now has its own hooks API, and we've really recommended a lot of patterns for TypeScript usage that simplify the TypeScript code that you would write. Along with that, we now have a lot of opinions and recommendations about the best approaches for using Redux, and we've captured these in a document that we call the Redux Style Guide. And when you put all these together, it's clear that Redux has really changed. And so I've started referring to this as modern Redux. It's still Redux. You're still dispatching actions and writing reducers and handling state immutably, but the way you write this code has changed drastically since 2019. And so because of that, these modern Redux patterns that we teach today are much, much easier to learn and use. So let's look at some of the details of how things have changed. So first off, React-Redux version 7 came out in early 2019, and it was a rewrite in response to a version 6 that didn't quite work out the way we wanted it to. And so we actually rewrote the guts of the Connect API to use React hooks internally. And so we put that out in early 2019. And that set the stage for us to actually design and ship a React-Redux hooks API. The design process for this took several months of discussion, going through technical constraints and naming and figuring out what hooks we should ship and how they should actually work. And we eventually settled on two hooks, useSelector and useDispatch. And they actually have a number of differences from the classic Connect API that we'll talk about in a minute. And so today, we now recommend using the hooks API as the default approach for working with Redux in your React components. Connect still works fine. We're not planning on making any changes to it, but we're also not planning on making any changes to it. Now, the hooks API does introduce a different set of trade-offs, and it's not even just with React-Redux specifically, but hooks in general have changed how we write React components. And I've written a couple articles that discuss some of the trade-offs, especially around this idea of separation of concerns. And I'd recommend going through those if you have some time. So let's look at these hooks for a minute. The first one is useSelector. And this is fairly similar in concept to the map state to props parameter in Connect. It gives you the entire Redux state and allows you to extract a value or some derived data from the store. It also subscribes to the Redux store. It will rerun your selector whenever actions are dispatched. And if the value that the selector returns changes, it will re-render your component with the new data. Now, it does actually change how it does the comparisons versus Connect. It does a reference equality check instead of a shallow equality check. And you can call useSelector multiple times in one component. So you don't have to return an object. You can just return whatever individual value. We also have a useDispatch hook, which literally just gives you the dispatch method from the store. And we've kind of dropped this idea of binding action creators. And instead, we give you dispatch, and it's now up to you to use that in your own handlers. On the one hand, this maybe adds a couple extra lines of code, but it also makes it a lot more clear what's actually happening behind the scenes. There's no more abstraction of, well, this is auto dispatching when I call this function. So right now, React-Redux is at version 7.2. It's very stable. We've put out a few minor tweaks to it, but we have no plans for any immediate changes in the near future. The longer term question is, what are we going to do in relation to React concurrent mode and suspense? And the issue here is that React concurrent mode wants to be able to pause rendering and really be able to reorder state updates as React sees fit based on events and priorities. And this doesn't really play all that well with external state management tools. Now, the React team has created an experimental hook called useMutableSource, and it's specifically designed for use with external state tools like Redux. So we're keeping an eye on this. It's a little hard to say exactly how things will play out until concurrent mode and suspense are actually fully released and we can play around with them. But most likely we're going to end up building a React-Redux version 8 with useMutableSource as the core piece of our implementation. Not 100% sure whether we'll be able to update Connect to use that. It's possible, we just won't know until we actually try it. If you are interested in knowing some more details about how React-Redux itself actually works, I have an extensive post called The History and Implementation of React-Redux, which goes through the details of what this library actually does and how we've changed the implementation multiple times over the last few years while keeping the public API basically the same. So let's talk about Redux Toolkit. Over the years, there's been a lot of different complaints about using Redux, and it's typically been things like there's too much boilerplate code, and I keep having to write all these things like action creators and action types, and it's too hard to set up a Redux store, and Redux forces me to make too many choices about adding extra libraries or configuration. And so Redux Toolkit was created to solve all those questions. And so the goal is to simplify common Redux use cases, provide some good opinionated defaults out of the box, and really simplify the Redux usage experience overall. We originally put it out as a package called Redux Starter Kit, but we renamed it to Redux Toolkit to avoid some confusion about what it is and how it works. Redux Toolkit is written in TypeScript, and we've designed it to simplify TypeScript usage as well. And I'd really like to put a shout out to my primary co-maintainer, Lenz Weber, who has done a very large portion of the development over the last couple of years, and especially around anything TypeScript related. So Redux Toolkit is meant to be useful for all Redux users, whether they're new or experienced. So what's in the box? Redux Toolkit is a set of standalone functions, and you can choose to use as many or as few of these as you want. And the first one is an API called configureStore. And this wraps around the basic Redux createStore function, and it provides you a good set of defaults. It automatically turns on the Redux dev tools, it automatically adds the Redux Thunk middleware, and it turns on some development mode only checks that catch common mistakes like accidental mutations. It even simplifies the process of defining your root reducer or adding additional middleware or store enhancers to the store setup. So really, for most applications, this takes 20 to 40 lines of code and shrinks it down into one call where it's very clear that I'm creating a Redux store. Here's the pieces of my reducer. Please do the rest for me. I don't care about the details. One nice thing about this is that instead of taking some positional parameters like createStore did, it actually takes several different options as a named options object. And so that makes it easier to see what each of these different options actually is. Now, one of the most common pain points with Redux over the years has been trying to do immutable updates. And I'm sure you've all seen a lot of these nested spread operations and concatenating and mapping over arrays. And the problem is that JavaScript is mutable by default. And so you have to do a lot of work to actually do immutable updates correctly. Well, there's a really cool library from Michelle Westrate, the author of MobX, called Immer. And the idea of Immer is that it can simplify immutable updates by letting you write mutating syntax. Now, if you look at Immer by itself, it provides a function called produce, and you pass in your initial data. And then you pass in a callback function that gets a draft value that looks like your initial data, and inside of there, it's safe to mutate that draft value. Immer tracks all those mutations internally, and it actually replays them to produce a safe and correct immutable update as the result. And so it's just as if you'd written all those nested spread operators by hand, but the code is a lot simpler and a lot easier to read. And this really fixes the issue of, accidentally forgetting to spread a level, or there's just so many ways that immutable updates can go wrong. So Immer really simplifies the process of writing immutable update logic. And so when we began putting together Redux Toolkit, we built our APIs around Immer. And so we have an API called createReducer, which simplifies the standard process of looking at an actions type field, figuring out how we're supposed to handle it, and running some logic in response. And so createReducer actually uses Immer internally, and so we can write mutating syntax in these reducers, and it becomes a safe and correct immutable update. Along with createReducer, we have an API called createAction, which probably should actually be named createAction creator. And you pass in an action type string, and it gives you back an action creator function that uses that type string and accepts a payload as an argument. So this simplifies a little bit of the code that you would have had to write, and saves you the trouble of trying to write those action creator functions by hand. But in practice, you won't actually even call createAction or createReducer in most of your own code. And that's because we have an API called createSlice. Now, if you think about it, the important thing in most Redux apps is really the reducer logic. And all this action creator, action type constant stuff is sort of secondary in a lot of ways. And so what createSlice does is it allows you to define the reducer functions that you want to handle. And it looks at the name that you gave to this slice and the name that you gave to these reducers, and it automatically generates action creators and action type strings based on those names. So I can give my slice a name like user, and I can give a reducer a name like update user or user updated, something readable like that. And in return, I automatically get my action creators and my action type strings for free. And this makes it really easy to organize your files using what's known as the ducks or the slice pattern, where you're putting all your Redux logic in a single file. And that really cuts down on the amount of code that you would have written compared to, just a couple years ago. Now, one pattern we've tried to encourage over the years is having reducer functions that can handle actions that were defined elsewhere in the code base. Maybe you have like an auth action that you dispatch whenever the user logs out, and you want to clear out the data in other portions of the state when that user logs out. So the createSlice API has an extra reducers field where you can listen to actions that were defined in other files. And so typically we would recommend doing things like writing thunks or selectors or other code related to this feature in the same file as this slice object. Now, file structures are always up to you, but this also cuts down on the number of files you would have had to go through when you focus on putting as much of the logic for a given feature into one file by default. The reselect library for writing memoized selectors has always been a standard part of the Redux ecosystem. And so Redux Toolkit just re-exports the create selector API from reselect so that you can just import it and use it right away. And with data fetching and async logic, we've always had a standard pattern where you write a thunk you dispatch one action before you make the request so that you could do something like setting a loading status flag to true. And then you dispatch another action after the API call is done, either a success action or a failure action. And because this is so common, Redux Toolkit includes an API called createAsync Thunk, which abstracts the process of defining those pending, fulfilled, and rejection action types. And it allows you to provide a payload creation callback where you can make your async request, return some data, and it will automatically dispatch the actions before and after the request based on the result of that promise. And then you can handle those action types in your slice and update your reducers accordingly. So this is an improvement over how most people would have handwritten a lot of their data fetching logic previously, but we'll actually see something else in a few minutes that simplifies things even further. The Redux docs have always recommended storing a lot of your data in a pattern known as normalized state. The idea is that many operations require looking up items based on their ID, and so it's better to keep those stored as an object where the keys are the item IDs and the values are the items themselves, instead of trying to store things as an array. But we've never had anything built in that really implements that kind of an approach. And so Redux Toolkit now has an API called createEntityAdapter, which provides pre-built reducer logic for doing a lot of the kind of common CRUD operations you would see. Things like inserting a whole bunch of items into this lookup table, updating some items, removing some items, or even upserting existing items. And you can use these adapter methods as either individual case reducer functions, like the books added example, or you can use them as quote-unquote mutating helper functions inside of our immer-powered reducers. The adapter API also helps generate some common selector functions. You can select one item by ID, you can select an array of all the common items, and it even has a basic sorting facility built in so that the select all selector returns those items in a sorted order. Over the years, we've seen a lot of the different problems that people run into using Redux, and by far the number one common mistake is accidentally mutating your data. And it's really hard to figure out when and how that actually happens. So Redux Toolkit actually includes a mutation detection middleware that we actually add to the store by default. And if you accidentally mutate your data, it will actually throw an error and tell you, here is the piece of the state that got mutated. And hopefully that gives you a pretty good idea of where and how the mutation actually happened. Since we also discourage keeping non-serializable values in the store, we have a second check that looks for those as well. So the idea is to try to catch some of those common mistakes early and help guide people towards fixing them. Now, the other nice thing here is that if you're using createSlice and createReducer, Immer actually makes accidental mutations basically impossible. So that really has eliminated the most common mistake that happens with Redux. Now, there's one other thing with Redux Toolkit that I am very, very excited to talk about. So earlier, I described how the ecosystem as a whole has really moved toward this idea of data fetching and caching instead of state management. And a few months ago, my Redux Toolkit co-maintainers, Lenz Weber and Matt Sikowski, sat down and began building a Redux-inspired take on a data fetching and caching solution. And we've given this the name of RTK Query. And it takes a lot of very obvious inspiration from other packages in the ecosystem like React Query and Apollo and Erkl. But we've built it on top of Redux Toolkit, and we've taken some very different design approaches to how it actually works. So RTK Query is meant to abstract the data fetching process completely. Instead of writing a bunch of thunks and loading state flags and reducers and use effect hooks to dispatch actions, you define a set of API endpoint descriptions. And these allow you to say, take these input arguments, generate these query parameters. Here's the server base URL where the request should be made. And it automatically does all the data fetching and the dispatching and the caching and generates reducers and logic to handle all that for you. And because it's built on Redux Toolkit, it has a UI agnostic core, but we actually then have some React specific functionality on top of that. And it will actually generate React hooks that handle kicking off all the data fetching, tracking the loading state, and re-rendering your component as that data comes back. And so with RTK Query, all that data fetching code in your application can go away completely. You just define some API endpoints, add the reducer and the middleware to your store, and import the hooks and use them in your components. So right now, we are finalizing the work on RTK Query. You can try it out right now in the RTK 1.6 alpha releases, available as Redux.js/toolkit@next. And we are hoping to try to finalize this within the next few weeks. We're doing some final renaming and fleshing out the documentation, but we hope to put this out live very, very soon. RTK Query also has some very powerful advanced features. So typically you would define a single API slice entry per server that you're going to talk to. And that one API slice might have many different endpoint definitions inside of it. So for example, if your actual backend server has endpoints for posts and users and comments in a typical REST API, you would actually define all of those as separate endpoints within a single API slice if they're all coming from the same base URL. RTK Query does not have a normalized cache, and there's a few different reasons for this. One is that if you look at something like Apollo or Erkl, trying to write a full cache that deduplicates data across different requests is a very hard problem. And it's not one that we are interested in trying to tackle ourselves right now. But we think, looking at how people are actually trying to use this, that just solving the general data fetching question is really what is going to be the big benefit for most people. We might look at trying to add some normalization down the road, but not anytime in the near future. So RTK Query will make requests, and it will cache the different responses based on the different inputs. So if I hit the same endpoint with different query parameters, it will cache those responses separately, and it will cache them basically as we receive them from the server. However, you do have the option to transform the responses any way you want. So if you'd like to take an array that you got back from the server and save it in a normalized form just for that one response, you could do that using something like our createEntityAdapter API. The hooks and the selectors also have the ability to select individual values out of a cached response. So you could have a list component that subscribes and uses a hook to kick off the data fetching. And then you could have your list item components that use the same hook, but just try to read a specific value out of the response based on an ID. We also just added a brand new cache query lifecycle set of functionality. And this really enables use cases like streaming updates from a backend server. Maybe you've got a chat room scenario where you want to fetch the initial list of messages when the user opens the chat room, but then you want to subscribe and push additional messages out to the client over time. And so this cache query lifecycle API allows you to do additional work while there is an active subscription, and you can insert those changes and update the cache data on the client. And so I think this is really going to unlock a lot of very cool use cases for people. We just merged this in the other day. At the time that I'm recording this, we have not put out a new alpha release with this yet. By the time you actually see this, it should be out and available in another RTK Query alpha. We've made some changes over the last year or so about how we recommend you use Redux and TypeScript together. So the first thing is that we recommend trying to infer some common core types based on the store itself. And so the way this works is you would create your Redux store with all the reducers, and then we recommend that you infer a root state type based on the combined type returned by the getState method. Along with that, we recommend that you infer an app dispatch type based on the store.dispatch function. From there, we suggest that you actually create some pre-typed React-Redux hooks that use those root state and app dispatch types. And this cuts down on a bit of the code you would have written in your components, but it also avoids some common mistakes. And the most common one we saw is that the basic Redux dispatch type doesn't know anything about thunks. And yet the Redux store typically has the Thunk middleware configured, and people are trying to dispatch thunks in their components. And if they just try to call use dispatch by itself and dispatch thunk, TypeScript doesn't recognize that as a thing that you can do. And so by consistently using these pre-typed hooks everywhere, you know that you've got the right types and it actually does match what the store is configured to do. So in your application code, in a slice file, what you'll typically do is you'll define a type for the state used in that slice. Use that as you define the initial state value, and then createSlice will infer the type of the state for that slice from the initial value. In the individual case reducers, you can use a payload action type to declare that your action payload is a certain type from there. And then that goes along and will get carried through to the generated action creators. In the components, you would then import those pre-typed React-Redux hooks and use them to read the state values and get dispatch and use it. And so this approach definitely cuts down on a lot of the boilerplate that we've seen from some of the patterns people have tried to use with TypeScript and Redux together. It's worth noting that we do have a couple of Redux templates for Create React App available at this point, one for plain JavaScript and one for TypeScript. And both of them come with Redux Toolkit and the React-Redux hooks pre-configured. So you can just call Create React App and pass in either the Redux or Redux TypeScript template as an option. And finally, we've been doing a lot of work to update the Redux documentation. So the original docs were very good, but they also had a lot of problems. And the biggest thing was they were originally written in 2015 to target a very, very different audience. You had discussion of Flux libraries and Backbone, and like the React ecosystem has just completely changed since then. And the original tutorials were good, but they also didn't really get into a lot of real world usage patterns. And some of the patterns that they did show were verbose and not ideal. For example, they showed organizing your files as separate folders for actions and constants and reducers and containers. And they really didn't have a lot of opinions. They just sort of said, yeah, here's 5 different ways to do something. It's up to you to figure out what you actually want to do. So a couple years ago, I filed an issue and said we really ought to redo our documentation. And I have several different goals out of this. I wanted to try to reorganize the content to be more logical. I wanted to rework our tutorials to show updated patterns and make things a lot simpler for users to get on board. I wanted to add real-world usage information to give better guidance on how to use Redux correctly. And I wanted to add a style guide section and actually show our opinions and best practices on how to use Redux. So I spent the first half of 2020 writing a brand new tutorial that I called the Redux Essentials tutorial. And this was a really, really big change because it actually teaches Redux Toolkit and the React-Redux hooks as the default way to use Redux. And it takes a top-down approach that jumps straight into building an application without necessarily worrying about how everything works internally. And I took a lot of inspiration from other doc sites and tutorials in trying to tell people, here's what you're going to learn, here's the prerequisites for this section, here's how this works, and here's runnable code sandbox examples built in. And so this is now the default tutorial in the Redux documentation. I followed that by reworking the existing Basics Advanced tutorial sequence. And so I rewrote this into a new tutorial that I've called the Redux Fundamentals tutorial. This one still starts out with what is an action, what is a reducer, what is state, and it shows how to write all this code by hand and works its way up and teaches all the principles behind how Redux actually works. But I've drastically reworked the sequence of the explanations. I've simplified a lot of the explanations to show easier patterns to learn and use. I've clarified the differences between the bare basics that you need to use Redux and typical usage patterns like action creators and selectors and normalized state and so on. And then it concludes with actually showing how Redux Toolkit simplifies all these actual usage patterns and why Redux Toolkit is the standard approach for using Redux. And along with that, I've also created a page called the Redux Style Guide. And this is modeled after something that the Vue docs had. And it lists all of our opinionated recommended best practices for using Redux. So it shows essential rules like never mutate state, don't have side effects and reducers. Strongly recommended patterns like use Redux Toolkit, use React-Redux hooks, use plain JS objects for your data. Model your actions as events and not setters. And more loosely recommended approaches like define your actions as domain/event name and use thunks for async logic. And we've gotten a lot of very, very positive feedback on this. A lot of people really, really appreciate having the guidance for the right way to use Redux. We do have a lot more work that needs to be done to update our documentation, and you can see those if you look for issues tagged docs in each of the different repositories. We need to really fill out this new using Redux section. I'd like to try to write some articles on using selectors and using thunks and other async logic in the near future. There's also a lot of existing pages that need to be updated to match our current recommended patterns. The React-Redux doc site tutorial still shows connect as the default. We've got a couple people who have volunteered to write a page that shows hooks as the default approach. That one's in progress right now. But we could also really use a usage guide page that talks about how to use those hooks effectively. The Redux Toolkit docs are being filled out right now with information on using RTK Query, but I think there's still some improvements we could make there as well. So if you are interested in helping out with any of the documentation stuff, here's the main issue in our repo. Please feel free to drop by and leave a comment. Lots of stuff to do, and I would really welcome the help. Longer term, we need to take a look at how React, Redux, and concurrent mode are going to live together and see how that's going to affect us down the road. And as a side note, my React Redux links list repo has been mostly unmaintained for the last couple years because I just haven't had time to work on it myself. So if anyone's interested in trying to help update some of the content there, please ping me. I'd really appreciate it. So hopefully that gives you an idea of what's going on with Redux today. I'm very excited about Redux Toolkit and RTK Query and the really positive feedback we've gotten on how much people really enjoy using Redux today. And I hope that this helps you improve your own applications, as well as have a better idea of when it even makes sense to use Redux in the first place. If you've got any questions, please feel free to contact me. I'm at AceMarkey on Twitter, Reddit, and Hacker News. I'm at Mark Erikson on GitHub and Stack Overflow. Please feel free to ping me and say hi. Thanks.